Okay, this week saw the release of Stellar Blade on PC, a PC port for a massively successful PlayStation 5
Stellar.
game. It is indeed stellar. You loved it, right, John?
I loved it. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
great.
really good game. And it's nice to see it's actually seems to have picked up some momentum on PC, which is interesting, bearing in mind that a lot of other PlayStation ports haven't quite maintained that momentum. Now, the question is it any good? Alex is very, very busy. We don't have time to do a full review. I have, however, taken a look at it, and I did test using the mainstream setup again, the Ryzen 5 3600 with the RTX 4060. And yeah, I just played the first couple of levels. And typically, I think it's fair to say that if there were systemic problems, foundational problems with the game, it would, maybe 80, 85, 90% chance probability that those issues would immediately present themselves on a PC like this. There is a fundamental issue which I will address, but I will say that the game seems to be running well on PC. And this was a major concern of ours, principally because it's Unreal Engine 4. And Unreal Engine 4 games on PC historically have not done particularly well. And yeah, I'm sure Alex could go into a lot more depth about that. I seem to remember at one point him saying it's great for demos, but that was kind of about it. Stellar Blade, though, it seems to be running well. You're getting very, very good frame rates. Again, I've chosen 1440p balanced DLSS here for settings. I'm using the high settings here, but with an important caveat. But before I go into that caveat, I've got to say smooth frame times, decent performance, very rarely drops beneath 60 frames per second, which I think is pretty good, right? No egregious sustained stutter in the way you'd possibly might think from an Unreal Engine game. It just seems to hum along quite nicely. The caveat is that the game, although it does have a pretty basic menu, does have a VRAM meter, and it tells you whether you're overcommitted or not on your current settings. And if you just go for the flat high setting, which, generally with Unreal Engine games tends to be sort of console equivalent, it does overcommit VRAM. It's sort of saying, whoa, think about what you're doing here. So what I did was to cut back 2 texture settings from high to medium. And that did seem to solve the issue. There didn't seem to be any sort of egregious stuttering issues, maybe 1 or 2. But the point is that medium settings just don't look great. That some of the ground textures look poor. It's really not the way that this game should be played. Now, who do we blame here? Do we blame the developer for not producing better textures for? Let's face facts. Probably a majority of the market will be using an 8GB graphics card. Or do we simply sort of point to the fact that, well, 8GB just isn't good enough for these console ports anymore? So I played through the first 2 levels on high settings, medium textures, but then at the end I noticed that, there's some textures here that they just don't seem to be appearing. Or they look excessively poor. So I dipped into the options menu and turned on high quality textures, and lo and behold, those textures suddenly appear. And so, yeah, I mean, I would recommend Stellar Blade, but I would recommend it to somebody who's got a higher than 8GB GPU. It looks as though 10 gigs is going to be all right. Not great though, right, John?
Yeah, I'm looking at your footage here actually right now, and it's pretty apparent. Lots of low res, blurry surfaces, textures just not drawing in. But at the same time, this is a game that was developed for PS5, right?
Yeah.
Sony was the publisher on this. I wouldn't want them to have limited that aspect just because they needed to target 8GB GPUs, right? I think this really just speaks to the fact that 8GB is not enough for proper console ports anymore. Maybe in terms of actual power it is, but in terms of like memory requirements, like we're beyond that point now.
Yeah.
And you can't be, I don't think you can be expected to get this type of experience perfectly executed on an 8GB card anymore. If you have an 8GB card, you just kind of need to understand that, like, yeah, there's going to be stuff like this where it just doesn't work optimally, and it's not really the fault of the game developer at that point, right? Like, this is just a limitation of how the game was built in its original state. not a matter of fault. And well, we've kind of been saying this for a while now, but I think what AMD was it that said recently, like 8 GB cards in their view are still targeting a very specific type of PC gamer that's playing very specific types of games. And that may be true. I just hope that the customer buying these understands this when they get into an 8 GB card these days. Like, you're not going to just be able to play everything across the board because of these VRAM limitations. So
I think what happens generally is at the lower end of the market, people buy to their available budget.
right,
They don't buy according to what games they're playing. And I think when you've got a 60 class card, you should expect to be able to play the latest games like a console can.
agreed.
So the concept that, a 5-year-old console is able to produce much better art than your brand new GPU that you just spent even $400 on, I think it's outrageous.
Yeah, when you put it that way, Rich, it really stands out more. You're right. It does feel like the GPU manufacturers are undershooting where they should be relative to the consoles, right? And this is something we've not really seen before in recent years, I feel, where like they're just not like, usually if you look at like last generation, right, it was very early on, like GPUs were generally hitting the target necessary for on the VRAM, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you weren't really seeing any GPUs that were really constrained by VRAM, whereas in relative to console ports.
Yeah.
So, and we're definitely seeing it this gen, and that's not good.
I'm reminded of a conversation we had with a senior executive at Gamescom last year where they asked us where we think games are being targeted. What's the target platform? And we said consoles, and they said mainstream PC. Do you remember that conversation?
Oh, yeah. I do vaguely remember that last year.
And the contention was that it's actually mainstream PC that's the target. I still think it is the consoles based. Stellar Blade obviously a console exclusive, but we see so many AAA games now, or games using latest technologies that are requiring the use of a non-mainstream GPU to get all of the finery of the console version. So I'd still say,
yeah, it still feels like consoles generally the target. And I mean, obviously doubly so with anything that was initially exclusive to consoles, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oliver, what's your thoughts on all of this?
I mean, I would certainly echo John's sentiments there. I think the textures are rough, but ultimately this is a case where the consoles have a certain spec. And this has been true for a very long time with the comparison between consoles and PC, but the consoles have a certain spec, and a good PC will need to exceed it for a console-like experience, or at least match it. PC GPUs need to have at least 12 gigabytes of VRAM, in my view. That's kind of essential. And it's unfortunate, not only that we're in this situation, but that we're in this situation some 5 years on from the console launch.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing that really kills me. Obviously, it launched
Exactly.
with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. PC GPUs did not commonly have like 4 gigabytes of RAM, right? Or
Sure.
6 gigabytes of RAM. But even still, now we're in this such a late period, and PC GPUs aren't really where they need to be. This isn't the most intense game in terms of demands on a system like the PlayStation 5. It is using Unreal Engine 4, but it's good to see that performance is basically fine. I know that John had some issues with the PS5 version, I think, initially, but those are mostly cleaned up for PS5 Pro, right, John? That was a bit of a revelation there, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, the issues on the regular PS5 are more performance in nature, right? Where certain modes were like struggling to lock to 60 and such. But by and large, it was pretty good out of the gate. Just the anti-aliasing stuff was weird because it varied a lot per mode. And then the PS5 Pro just added PSSR, and it was one of the few really good PSSR implementations. Obviously, the game has no ray tracing features, so that seems to play nicely for PSSR, as we found.
Yeah, just sort of to back up my point, the 4060 does support frame generation, and frame generation actually works quite well on this. You're, 1440p DLSS balanced, and it's typically north of 100 frames per second, which, you're not going to be doing on a PS5 or even a Pro, so it supports multi-frame generation. So, it all says to me that you've got this GPU that's clearly got a relatively decent amount of compute power for the task at hand. It's got features that can take you beyond the console experience, but you're going to have to put up with ugly textures. So yeah,
Oh,
that's kind of where I'm at with Stellar Blade PC. Good port, but you've got to have a decent amount of VRAM to enjoy it at its best.